I'm going to start by saying I'm really nervous and I'm not sure why, and that's been intensified by Jonathan's amazing talk a minute ago. But what I wanted to do really was to start by thinking about this kind of big question about the 30 years of animal studies with a caveat. I'm going to focus on sort of 15 years rather than the whole 30, because that's the sort of time that I've been involved really with animal studies. And I'm going to do that by thinking athwart two phenomena whose relationship might seem tangential on first glance, but please bear with me. On the one hand, we've got this academic field of animal studies, and on the other hand, we've got the Greg sausage roll. Okay, I'm not going to think about maybe the sausage or the intricacies of the sausage roll per se, but I am interested in what the sausage roll represents. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book about contemporary vegan praxis, as Erica kindly said. And in it, I was trying to ask what it might mean ethically, politically, and socially when something like veganism shifts from something that's kind of quite a marginal practice to the mainstream. And the last chapter in the book focused maybe a little bit ungenerously on what I call in that chapter plant-based capitalism. And all I meant by that was this kind of resurgence of vegan praxis as a form of, I suppose, consumption-based activism that really focused on individualistic food choice, the choice to eat what one wants, whatever one wants, whatever pleases one, and a sort of, I suppose, a narrowing of the focus to diet rather than veganism as perhaps a more holistic philosophy that asks more expansive questions about relationships between humans and animals, but also one certainly in the UK that has quite a long activist history of trying to think about other inequities associated with labour relations and environmental politics as well. And I'm going to start by kind of touching on a few extracts from interviews with long-term vegans that I sort of undertook when writing this book, that I think crystallised, I think hopefully as will become clear, something interesting about animal studies as well. So I'm starting with this quote from Ali, who was really reflecting on dramatic shifts that have happened over the past 15 years or so related to the accessibility of vegan food. So Ali was kind of joking here, but was just pointing to the fact that it used to be quite hard to go out and kind of consume vegan products, to kind of live easily as a vegan, I suppose. Existing food infrastructures just didn't accommodate vegan eating very easily. It would have been quite hard to order like a round of vegan sandwiches through university catering, for instance. The sort of flip side of this is people were quite kind of excited about this newfound accessibility, but were also kind of wary as well about some, I suppose, side effects and consequences of the popularization of veganism that they felt maybe kind of undercut some of its more radical potentials. So we had some people, for instance, who were kind of reflecting on the fact that, yes, vegan food is more accessible than ever, but should there be this kind of uncritical celebration of all manner of vegan products, no matter how kind of problematic the institutions producing these products? So people were talking a lot about longer histories of vegan praxis and activism, and how maybe that should inform sort of decisions about what could be considered ethical and vegan in the present. And they were concerned that that wasn't happening at the moment. Other people raised sort of slightly more complex concerns about a sort of paradoxical displacement of animal ethics from kind of core reasons for being vegan. So people were kind of quite enthusiastic about the rise of factors like environmental politics and how that was a driver behind veganism, but also a little bit worried about whether that was decentering animal ethics as a kind of core concern. And another kind of thing that a lot of people reflected on was shifts in the material culture associated with veganism and what that might mean socially and politically. DIY vegan infrastructures just didn't seem as necessary as they once were, from hand-drawn photocopied recipe books to small cafes full of activist posters, product lists, meetup groups. These things that were a fundamental part of how to kind of undertake day-to-day life as a vegan just aren't as prominent anymore. You can just go to a kind of cafe around the corner and get your vegan latte and a sort of toasty, for example, without really having to kind of worry about doing anything specific or special. And the reason why people were worried about this wasn't just due to some nostalgia over kind of, hand-drawn recipe books. It was because they were worried about the kind of lack of opportunity that there were to make political connections as veganism has become popularized. So a key example of this that someone gave was that, you used to spend ages searching out the one vegan cafe in a city. You'd get there and there'd probably be a sort of hunt sub poster, there'd probably be leaflets that kind of pointed to anti-fascist activism. There probably would be leaflets that would talk about the cooperative ethos of the cafe. So there were all these connections with environmental, labour politics, etc. And people were just saying, are those opportunities still present when you go to your cafe around the corner and get your vegan latte, So yes, it's about nostalgia, but it's also about something more complicated and politicised than that. But with all those kind of worries kind of foregrounded, people were also concerned that by raising them, they didn't want to gatekeep. They were concerned that by looking back in this nostalgic way about the heyday of activist veganism, perhaps that would be seen as a bit elitist, as this kind of holding up the past as this thing to aspire to and kind of looking down on people who got your latte, etc. from the corner coffee shop. As Benny says here, this is the dawning of the world that we fought for so long and hoped for. And just because it doesn't look exactly the way we envisaged, maybe we can't be too proprietorial about it. So I've spent the past few minutes talking about veganism, but the question that probably comes to mind is, well, how does any of this relate to animal studies as a kind of academic field? What's the relationship between any of these quotes and animal studies? And in the rest of the talk, I want to make kind of 3 key points where I think there are some productive linkages to be made. So firstly, I'm kind of interested in reflecting on concern about histories, legacies, lineages, which I think are sort of threaded across the interviews, but have also been kind of threaded across quite a lot of the talks that have happened over the past couple of days. In particular, I think there are concerns about whose scholarship and which forms of ethics are included and excluded as the field evolves. Secondly, there are these concerns, and I think this has really come to the fore on talks talking about the environmental humanities, about whether non-human animals are kind of being sidelined. And I'm going to talk in particular about the way certain theoretical paradigms might have fed into that a little bit. And I'm going to close by reflecting a bit more briefly on struggles over new meanings and futures of the field. And I think, again, there are some interesting parallels with these discussions and contestations about what veganism is and means in the present as well. In particular, I'll talk about some of the challenges associated with interdisciplinary institution buildings and how that feeds into some of these discussions. So, histories and lineages. Some of you may have seen this slightly confusing diagram before. And the point I want to make when talking about histories and lineages is that I think one way of narrating the field, I'm not saying it's the way, it's one way, has been as a process of animal studies kind of identifying and reckoning with its own exclusions that have occurred as different bodies of thought have come to prominence at different moments in time. And I've chosen this diagram for several reasons. Firstly, it kind of appears in a chapter in Wolf's work called Animal Studies, in which Wolf sketches out a genealogy of the field that organises different thinkers according to their relationship with post-humanism. I'm going to come back to that shortly because I think it's worth probing in a bit more depth. But the reason I've put it up now is obviously, I'd look at this and I wouldn't say that maybe you get an instantaneous like, yes, I understand that when you look at what's going on here. And as those of you who've maybe read the book might recognise, it is a rich book, but it's also not the most accessible text in terms of its conceptual workings. And for that reason, I think it speaks to the first kind of fracture in terms of the histories and lineages of animal studies that I wanted to touch on, which is the kind of emergence of critical animal studies, which I think is a really important moment. So if we look at this kind of quite well-known quote by Steve Best, for instance, in his sort of influential essay, which calls for the rise of critical animal studies, mainstream animal studies here is accused of burying profound ethical, social, political, and environmental issues of animal exploitation in dense theoretical webs, which leads to politically charged issues being depoliticized, theory being divorced from practice, resistance, and struggle. And I think there've been a lot of debates about this over in the wake of these arguments. I think people have pointed out that maybe we shouldn't disband with theory totally, and also pointed out that critical animal studies has carried its own exclusions in terms of whose voices are centralised in it. But nonetheless, I think it does speak to something that still kind of has ramifications today, even if it's framed in a slightly different way. The second kind of, I suppose, fractural kind of contestation over the lineages of the field and the knowledges that it's sort of drawn upon is influential scholarship that's drawn attention to the sort of erasure of ecofeminism, which I think is a really prominent narrative. So Susan Freeman, for instance, has got quite a well-cited essay on this, which talks about being troubled by the way the kind of sort of history of animal studies as it was being narrated in the first decade of this century was kind of eclipsing dozens of books going back some 40 years, long before Derrida's essay on animals was brought to the attention of English speakers. There's a kind of real sense again here that theory, capital T theory, was kind of eclipsing a sort of long-standing body of feminist literature about non-human animals. What I think has been really productive more recently is this article by Fiona Probyn-Rapsey, Siobhan O'Sullivan, and Yvette Watt, which I think is really helpful both in kind of showing how this problem and this kind of marginalisation of feminist thought has kind of continued, but also I think the way that they talk about this is worth building on and drawing out a little bit. And I think this sentence is particularly evocative. So as they talk about here, they don't just make a genealogy that talks about kind of the marginalisation of feminism. They talk about it in relation to structural factors within the contemporary university. And this really kind of got me thinking, because I think in this emphasis on structural conditions that maybe underpin whose knowledges are centralised and whose aren't, I think it's like incredibly productive because it helps to complicate some of the earlier concerns raised by critical animal studies about the loss of animal ethics. And it made me think really, is this loss perhaps not just due to a kind of ideological alignment or a purposeful decision, but due to certain academic labour conditions that kind of consecrate certain forms of knowledge and not others? Is it perhaps because to gain academic capital, it's more acceptable to treat animals as the object of study, to press them in service in support of wider conceptual and empirical contributions to disciplines, than to treat them as political and ethical subjects that are deserving of engagement in their own right and on their own terms. And I think these critiques are really important and persuasive because they kind of start to sort of push at the way that it's not just about the exclusion of gender, it intersects with class, labour conditions in very kind of particular ways that are important. And I think this leads me to a critique that's been made of ecofeminism itself as carrying some erasures, in the sense that historically it's kind of tended, as Erica Cudworth puts here in this kind of, I think, quite important book chapter, to sort of itself marginalise frameworks other than gender to think about human-animal relations. Historically, anyway, this has been redressed in recent years more, I think. This use of an all-encompassing theory of gender relations to explain intersected oppressions. And I want to kind of use this kind of reflection as a jumping off point to turn to, I think, perhaps the most profound set of critiques about animal studies that I think speak to Jonathan's talk and the points raised in that. And that's a body of work that has kind of called into question the concept of anthropocentrism itself, or certainly how anthropocentrism and narratives of human exceptionalism have tended to be talked or have been talked about in certain strands of animal studies, as though they're these totalizing frameworks that are manifested evenly across all parts of the world. And obviously, like, this really important decolonial scholarship has made these very significant interventions in rethinking what anthropocentrism means and how it's manifested. Some of the most important work, most famous work perhaps, by Zakiya Iman-Jackson, which kind of really, I think, questions why certain canonical thinkers have been used in animal studies to kind of decenter the human. Why, for instance, is it continental philosophy and sometimes analytic philosophy that sort of grounded these debates, rather than decolonial thought that's had a very rich history of interrogating the liberal humanist subject? And this has then led to kind of a number of other theory, or a number of other allied thinkers have sort of then questioned, well, can we just assume that the human is always placed above the non-human? Should we be drawing these kind of universalizing conclusions about this? And as Jackson puts it in Becoming Human, and I think this is targeted at certain thinkers in animal studies, particularly those allied with, I suppose, like post-humanist animal studies in particular, there's a risk in advancing the thesis that human-animal binarism is the original and foundational paradigm upon which discourses of human difference, including or especially racialization, was erected. And this kind of argument, this critique of broad brush narratives about anthropocentrism, I think really made me feel and reflect on how I've been overly broad brush and a lot of the things that I'd written about over the past kind of 10 years or so. And really started to question, well, is anthropocentrism even the right framing of the question? Is it even the right terminology? Should we be using terms like human exceptionalism? And I kind of reflected on these in particular in a review article I wrote a couple of years ago for this year's work in critical and cultural theory, where I kind of took, I suppose, hope from the critical and reflexive way in which anthropocentrism remained really salient as an analytic framework in these texts, but was being dealt with in such a situated way that I think it kind of helped to navigate some of the problems identified by Jackson. This book, Animalia, has got a really great essay by Jonathan in it again, but it was kind of, I think these books I found particularly productive in kind of thinking about how to resist universalizing assumptions about the intersection of oppressions and how these oppressions are ordered. In some instances across these texts, they showed that the dynamics of how anthropocentrism intersects with other inequities meant that particular animals, those deemed especially valuable and who are the focus of human love, are privileged above the lives of certain groups of people, as well as prioritized over less lovable species. Though anthropocentrism might still be entangled with many of these encounters, these cases still trouble overly neat narratives about human exceptionalism. But what I suggested in the essay as well is that although it's important to be critical of overly general narratives about the way anthropocentrism works, it's also important to resist being overly hasty in just dispensing with these frameworks outright. The layers upon layers of empirical and theoretical evidence provided by these historical, ethnographic, geographical, philosophical, and feminist activist work that's outlined in the essay, I think shows that anthropocentrism is still a potent material and discursive force, and human exceptionalism does lead to kind of all sorts of violence against non-human animals in all sorts of contexts. At the same time, it's vital to kind of be situated about how anthropocentrism is figured. And I found it really hopeful in terms of the way that these texts were doing this. And it really kind of made me feel that maybe contemporary animal studies scholarship is finding ways of dealing, or certainly recognizing, if not reckoning with, past exclusions in order to craft alternative pathways forward, even though I think a lot of work still needs to be done. Back to Wolff's diagram. So I'm now going to move to a second related point in Wolff's diagram, and this time reflects a little bit more closely on animals themselves. So just as there's concern that animals are being sidelined in vegan praxis, I think similar concerns have been raised in animal studies. Obviously, we started with a quote from Critical Animal Studies that's making that allegation specifically, but some of the discussions, again, about environmental humanities perhaps make similar points. But I want to trace how these concerns, at least in part, have congealed around how non-human animal agency has been figured in particular strands of animal studies. So in this corner of Wolff's diagram, for instance, are the humanists, post-humanists, and what these people are categorized as for Wolff are kind of extending liberal humanist frameworks to non-human animals in order to kind of say, well, we should treat animals as social and political subjects, afford them rights, etc. And Wolff's kind of critical of this and sets them against the people in this corner, the post-humanists, who are kind of represented by people like Donna Haraway, Derrida, Latour, and Luhmann. And according to Wolff, these figures offer a much more sort of radical redistribution of agency beyond the human. And in doing so, they kind of contest the premise of humanism rather than deepening it and extending it. I'm going to do something really crude here to sort of summarize these distinctions. Fundamentally, I think what it points to is a distinction between perspectives in animal studies that are framed as truly non-anthropocentric and offer this radical redistribution of agency, and then work that kind of undercuts its own aims through focusing on humanist ideas of subjectivity that suggest things are of value if they're somehow like humans and have sort of human capabilities, etc. And I want to spend the next kind of few minutes just dwelling on this opposition, because I think it's had some really profound consequences for which work has been in and out of favour in animal studies and how particular work has been consecrated, framed, etc. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that a huge amount of work that falls under the rubric of animal studies today would fall into this kind of top banner here, using language from science and technology studies, literary animal studies, more than human geographies, post-humanism, that's just created this new language really for conceiving of non-human animals, their agencies, etc. This vocabulary kind of shifts that idea of agency away from being a human property and emphasizes world-making entanglements between human and more than human beings. So I wanted to kind of ground this a little bit by focusing on a particular thinker who I believe has been quite influential, not somebody appearing in this quadrant of Wolff's diagram, but somebody who I think has been really influential on these thinkers and who many of them kind of engage with. And that's the work of Vincent Depay, whose work I think is really beautiful, really wonderful in many ways, but I think also speaks to certain frictions between different strands of animal studies that I think are worth kind of pushing and probing a little bit more detail. So why I think Depay's work is really interesting and important is because the examples that are engaged in with it are kind of a really helpful interrogation of how other species are positioned as being kind of cognitively or emotionally somehow lower than humans. And one such example, as pictured here, is the case of Clever Hans, who was a horse who rose to fame in Germany in the early 20th century, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this case, for his apparent ability to count. So he'd tap his hoof the correct number of times when he was given sums by his trainer. But sadly, it was revealed that Hans was actually sensing when he needed to stop and start counting by interpreting the body language of his trainer. Couldn't really do sums. Everyone, thought it was a hoax. And what's kind of interesting is this case is routinely held up as illustrating biases that affect attempts to assess animal intelligence. If you look at something like the Wikipedia entry about this, for instance, it states that, quote, "The Clever Hans effect is used in psychology to describe when an animal or a person senses what someone wants them to do, even though they're not deliberately being given signals," noting that it's important to take this effect into account when testing animals' intelligence. And what I think Depay does so beautifully is reread this case and foreground how the framing of Clever Hans as a hoax just reinforces a really anthropocentric notion of what intelligence is, an ability to count, while neglecting the more radical potentials inherent in Hans's relationship with his trainer. Framing this event as simply a hoax is an impoverishing critical move for Depay. It subtracts something from the world. In contrast, as I think is really articulated nicely here, kind of advocates an additive approach to understanding what's happening. And it's this ethos that's informed a much broader and highly influential argument across animal studies, that it's really important to pay attention to the species-specific behaviours, capabilities, capacities of non-human animals. And that act of paying close attention, often through kind of care work and bodily engagement, creates space for learning new things, for understanding animals in new ways, and also perhaps, ideally, create space for non-human animals to kind of impose new obligations on humans who engage with them. And I kind of dwelled on Depay for quite a while here, but that's because this kind of observation has informed a model of care that's been championed in animal studies and depicted as radically non-anthropocentric. Donna Haraway, for instance, contrasts Depuy's approach with utilitarian models of rights and liberation based on suffering. Instead, there's a sense that the kind of recognition of entanglement and sort of relational encounter-based ethics that sort of emerges from engagements with non-human animals is kind of radical in sort of turning things around, in creating space for new knowledge, in overturning anthropocentrism. I think, though, in light of the kind of influence of this body of theory, of this idea of care, it sort of warrants further interrogation. And that there are some really important questions about just how non-anthropocentric this understanding of care really is. And what I find particularly interesting when I've put these two books together, essentially, because they're both engaged with this understanding of care, but come to really different conclusions. And I'm interested in really thinking about, well, why is that? How is this possible? Does it say something about maybe the limitations and tensions of this understanding of care and bodily attunement itself? So Gruen's work, for instance, argues that empathy for non-human animals can be kind of fostered through relations with them, through these kind of entanglements. And I think it's a beautiful book that really talks about how kind of empathy and kind of desire for improving the conditions and the sort of lives of non-human animals can kind of arise from encounters with them, from careful engagements, from paying attention, from fostering attunement. On the other hand, quite similar arguments are made by this book, Researching Animal Research, which is forthcoming, produced by colleagues working on the Animal Research Nexus project. And similarly, they kind of suggest there's something powerful about bodily engagements, care work, relations with non-human animals, and that change can kind of emerge from that context. However, whereas Gruen sort of suggests that these changes can lead to institutional transformation and maybe even the cessation of certain practices that are deemed exploitative for non-human animals, Researching Animal Research is much more focused on sort of improving conditions within sites such as laboratories. So it's this difference, I suppose, between the same body of theory being used on one hand as kind of supporting an agenda for institutional change, and on the other hand, for kind of improving a more sort of welfareist agenda for sort of improving care in institutions. And I was really kindly asked to write a kind of critical intervention for Researching Animal Research. So I'm just going to summarize a couple of points I made in that I think point to some of the limitations perhaps of care that comes from sort of entanglement, embodied encounters, attunements, etc. So the first point I make really sort of summarizes an article I wrote with Greg at the back there about laboratory beagles. And we kind of made this point because we were looking at the first large-scale experimental beagle colony, which was constructed and run at the University of California, Davis in the mid-20th century, to test the effects of radiation on a living population, in this instance, laboratory beagles. And when kind of reading all of the documentation around this colony, what struck us was that the language used by the scientists to describe these experiments was really close to wording used in contemporary animal studies scholarship about the transformative potential of embodied care in a way that was quite uncomfortable, actually. Researchers explicitly emphasized the importance of paying attention to what mattered to the beagles, and that this could allow them to transform their research environment in response to these observations. And it was changed. Everything from cage design to the type of gravel used in flooring, to the level of contact between caretakers and beagles was redesigned based on these close observations to maximize beagle contentedness and make them happy with their environment. And our arguments in this context, and certainly the arguments I drew out in the Researching Animal Research chapter, were kind of twofold. Firstly, for all of these transformations and for all of the language of care, it's important not to lose sight of the fact that these were experiments that induced radiation poisoning in dogs for human benefit. Secondly, I think laboratory beagles reveal the limitations of centering animal ethics on recognition of animal agency that emerges within existing institutional spaces like animal laboratories. And I think this can often happen in ethnographically focused work where you're zooming in on particular relations. And what's really important is situating them in particular histories and contexts. In focusing just on human-animal relations in themselves and zooming in on those kind of embodied encounters, the social scientist might see a dog that seems happy and that loves its cage without taking into account why said dog is caged, how it came to love, and then use that as evidence that a particular practice is ethical and is kind of this co-shaping symmetrical process of agency being expressed. And this leads to a second point that, as I say, I talk about in the chapter that draws on my book, which I sort of write a chapter on this in my book, What Comes After Entanglement. If bodily caring relations and processes of attunement are seen as the privileged site of ethics that turns things around, this might also privilege certain forms of expertise that could marginalise critique. So in this book, I kind of describe this type of problem as hierarchies of care, and I pointed to a paradox. Sometimes in animal studies, the most kind of transformative modes of care, as talked about by Donna Haraway, are seen as those that emerge from close bodily attunements with non-human animals. Yet when it comes to some of the most contentious relations with non-human animals, whether that's animal agriculture or laboratory research, this form of bodily care can only be practiced by those who have access to those spaces and are working within those institutions. And this has sometimes resulted in a situation where practices ranging from slaughterhouse design to pedigree dog breeding are framed as ethical, caring, even loving. And there are kind of examples in the literature where all of these types of claims are made. While activist work that critiques or contests these practices from an inevitable distance are framed as kind of retrograde, people, kind of ignorant activists not really knowing or having the expertise to know what proper care for animals might mean. And I think this situation is quite dangerous and sort of forecloses particular forms of critique in kind of worrying ways. So shortly after, though, writing this chapter and feeling kind of, it was the culmination, it was quite cathartic, and it was the kind of culmination of a lot of worry I'd had about trends that I was kind of perceiving in animal studies. I again had some hope when writing a second essay for this year's work in critical and cultural theory about animal studies, where I just found a lot to be quite positive about. What I kind of argued in this second essay was that a lot of the scholarship emerging in recent years seemed to be kind of engaging in institutional critique in a much more sustained way. So kind of maintaining maybe a critical impulse that formerly would be associated with critical animal studies, but then also combining this with quite a careful attentiveness to critical and cultural theory. So I've been obviously, I've sort of talked about Defray's work positively, then being quite negative, but obviously there's something really powerful and important about having this call to pay attention to the sort of specificity of non-human animals. And it was kind of really valuable to see work that was, yes, recognizing that, engaging with those theoretical frameworks, but at the same time thinking about how that sat with critique in really important ways. And this brings me on to meanings and futures. So as I said, I had this quite kind of hopeful, positive narrative, and then I read Dominic's essay for this year's work, which has just come out, which is a great essay on this topic. And this essay for this year's work in critical and cultural theory was a little bit more cynical about my kind of grand claim that critique is kind of coming together with theory in these kind of interesting and sophisticated ways that were really positive. And I think I really kind of found this quote particularly powerful. So as Dominic says here, you know, maybe these things are coming together in productive ways, but is this because scholars have found novel ways of reconciling these allegedly antithetical positions? Is it because they're productively disregarding this antithesis altogether? Or is it more of an unconscious development as newcomers to the field are indifferent to or perhaps unaware of what seems to be becoming legacy debates? Maybe it's also got something to do with the ascendancy of other research areas like the environmental humanities. And we've talked about that obviously a lot already, so I won't delve into it. But I think this is a kind of really important set of discussions And as with the popularisation of vegan politics, I think there's something really significant to say here about the potentials and pitfalls of something rising to prominence. And for me, something that's been really exciting about animal studies in recent years is precisely the sort of transdisciplinary interest in the topic. And I think it's important to note, as people have done, and I think will do when talking about their struggles within particular disciplines, I know Linda's maybe got a talk on this shortly, is that, you know, in many disciplines, it's still hard to talk about animals and sort of find space and kind of legitimate it as a kind of area of concern. And sociology is kind of one of those fields where I think it's more difficult. In other fields, I think such as geography, for example, there's a much kind of stronger and clearer tradition and space within tiny journals like Environment and Planning E, and the launch of the Animal Geography's RGS group, which I know you've had a key role in, Jamie. And I think the environmental humanities is kind of really interesting in how it fits into these debates. Because while I kind of wholly agree with some of the criticisms being made and the way that the legacies of animal studies aren't always foregrounded, I think there are still these moments of potential where you do see sort of surprising intersections. So I think the discussion yesterday was, you know, what happens to spaces like slaughterhouses? Where do they come in? And it was kind of really gratifying for me to disclaim I'm involved in this journal. But aside from that, it's really gratifying for me recently to see this special edition of Multi-Species Justice come out, where the slaughterhouse was a kind of really central site of interrogation. And there's a whole article called sort of Meditations on Hell, I believe, where it's kind of interrogating the site of the slaughterhouse and thinking about how industrially farmed animals can and should be centralized in frameworks that we might ordinarily associate with the environmental humanities. So on a very kind of final point though, I wanted to close by making a slightly different observation about legacies. As with veganism itself, I don't just think it's important to reckon with intellectual legacies, but also the important legacies that are preserved and maintained by institutions. One of the things that I always feel about vegan practice is that amidst all the excitement of popularization, it's really important to support and recognize the work that has enabled something that was really hard and quite marginal to persist over the decades. And I think the same is true of animal studies. And while I do think that carving out space for animals in particular disciplines is absolutely vital work, at the same time, I think maintaining a wider sense of an animal studies community is really vital in creating the exchanges, support and solidarity that I think gives many of us the energy to kind of continue when we will have to work in a more isolated way back within our disciplines. As an interdisciplinary subject area, I think something that's been critically important is really the work of people like Erica and the British Animal Studies Network and the conferences and other events that so many people have kind of put energy and work into sustaining that allow us to then, as I say, go back to our disciplinary homes and do that work. So all I wanted to close on my very final work is saying it's really important that we've had spaces like this to allow the legacies of animal studies to be remembered. But I think what's been really exciting over the past couple of days is really thinking about what animal studies could be in the future and having that platform to really reflect on future work that builds on those legacies, I think is so critically important. And it's spaces like this that I think do give me genuine hope for the future. So I wanted to close, therefore, with a thank you for everyone's participation, but particularly to Erica for putting on the event. So it's been really wonderful for me so far. So thank you.